Hello, hello, hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. So good to have you here. We are so excited to see all of your faces and your icons and your kitchens and your libraries and your all sorts of other places. Wherever you are, you're in the right place. I'm Gibson, Fay-LeBlanc, and on behalf of Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, thanks for being here. We're so excited to host this event tonight with our friends at Mechanics Hall, which is where this event was supposed to be tonight, as part of their First Friday series, and with our friends at Print, a Bookstore. And we're so excited to have Sandell Morse here to launch her book, The Spiral Shell. I have 4 really quick bits of business. If you've been at an event with me before, you've probably heard a couple of these before, but you just bear with me, I'll go quickly. One is that, and we're all getting used to Zoom. I think many of us are more used to it than we ever thought we'd be, but you're all muted. You were muted as you came in. So if you could just stay on mute for now, that's great. We'll reduce all the dogs and other kinds of noises that happen. I recommend that you be on speaker view. So right now, depending on, you might be seeing the whole Brady Bunch version of everybody on the call, which is kind of fun. But once we start our event, it's good to be on speaker view, which is in the top right of your Zoom screen. You'll see it'll either say gallery view or speaker view. And you can click on that and you'll just see one person at a time who's talking. And down at the bottom is the chat button. And if you have a question during the course of the event, you should go ahead and ask it. Or if you just want to say something, we will be doing a Q&A towards the end. So we'll remind you. And we'll also post a link to buy a copy of Sandell's book from Print, which is something you should definitely all do. All right, so before we get further, I think Annie Leahy from Mechanics Hall is going to jump in here for a moment.
Hey Gibson, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all, and of course, we of course wish that we were all gathering in our beautiful historic library at 519 Congress Street. For those of you who don't know, this is the 200th anniversary of the Mechanics Hall Library. We are the 8th oldest membership library in the country. And of course, we would love to be all gathering with you in our beautiful historic library this evening. But I guess this is the next best thing. But it's lovely to see many of you and lots of familiar faces. I want to say an enormous thank you to Gibson, Fay-LeBlanc, and Maine Writers and Publishers, and a huge amount of gratitude, obviously, to our partners at Print. This is the First Friday series that we started with them several months ago, almost a year ago now going on. Has been such a lovely collaboration and has invited into our community just a tremendous amount of new voices and people who have been able to discover the library that didn't know about it previously. And of course, our biggest thanks and gratitude goes to Sandell for joining us this evening and sharing with us this incredible piece of work, and I'm truly looking forward to this discussion with you, Sandell, this evening. And certainly one of the themes of this book is survival during a time of crisis and how people kind of retain a sense of hope. And so somewhat accidentally, or maybe on purpose, we have found ourselves discovering this book with you this evening. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion with you and sharing it with our community here online. So many thanks to you in particular for joining us this evening and sharing this piece of work with us. And I'll toss it back to you, Gibson. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Annie. And let's get Sandell in here. Sandell is the author of The Spiral Shell, A French Village Reveals Its Secrets of Jewish Resistance in World War II. She's published widely in literary magazines, including Plowshares, the New England Review, Ascent, Fourth Genre, Solstice, and Brevity. She has won awards from the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, been nominated for 2 Pushcarts, and a Best to the Net. She has been an associate artist at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, a fellow at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and has had residencies at Wild Acres and Hewn Oaks, and lives here in York. Sandell, welcome.
Thank you, Gibson. Thank you so much. I really have to add my thanks to everyone else's because I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks to you, Gibson, and MWPA, to Print, and to Mechanics Hall. I was at the Lily King launch at Mechanics Hall, and we joked and we said, well, this may be our last public gathering, and I think it was. And Annie, at that time, I asked to see the library because I had expected this event to be there, and it is absolutely so beautiful. So hopefully there will be many, many more events there shortly. So I'm going to briefly tell you how I came to write this book, and then I'm going to read a brief passage, and we have some photos for you to see of places, and I'll explain a little bit about the events there, and then we'll see where we go from there. So in 2011, at age 71, I was awarded a residency at Moulin à Neuf, which is an artist's retreat in Auvillars, France. Auvillars is a very, very tiny little village, and the retreat is owned and operated by the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and I've been going there for years and years. Well, before I left home, I decided I'd research the village. I wanted to know where I was going, and I was actually also looking for new work. So I found out that the village was on the pilgrimage route, and that meant that it would end up eventually at the Shrine of St. James in Santiago del Compostela. So I became interested in pilgrims and pilgrimage routes, and then I began thinking of crusaders. And whenever I think of crusaders, I think about, well, where were the Jews when the crusaders were marching through? And then I began thinking about the Second World War. And I wondered if Jews had lived in the village then. And I knew France had been occupied, but I really had no idea what that meant. A friend sent me a name, and this was the name of a young boy, 9 years old, and she said he was a resistance courier, and he lived in the village with his mom and dad, and his name was Jean Hirsch, or Hirsch in English. And so my maiden name is Hirsch. And I wasn't going on a hunt for ancestors, but there was something about the matching names that just hooked me. And in a way, I fell down into these stories. And I did really, had no idea what I was doing, but I just kept pursuing lead after lead after lead. And this book is a double journey. It's my uncovering of the village's secret history. And it's also a journey in which I move back to a more Jewish identity than I had had before. So I'm going to read to you first, just from the very beginning, so I don't have to tell you anything. It's all right here. I knew so little of my own history. On my father's side, I had 2 names, Henriette Ducasse and Jacques Hirsch, my great-great-grandparents, both born in Héricourt, France, a commune in the Alsace that used to go back and forth between France and Germany, a spoil of war. Newly married, the couple sailed into New York Harbor, and as far as the family knew, they washed up onto American shores without a past. My father told me only those names, no names of their parents, grandparents, sisters, or brothers, no stories of a family's joys or its heartbreaks and struggles. Whatever had gone before evaporated into the air of a brand new world. My father told me stories of his family's American successes: a brownstone on the Upper East Side, a shoe store on Fifth Avenue, a block long, he would say, the space between his gesturing hands growing wider and wider. For me, a child given to fantasy and fairy tales, that shoe store grew into a department store and the brownstone into a castle. Yet there was truth to my father's stories. I had a newspaper clipping dated 1902, probably from the society pages of the Hartford Courant, announcing a marriage and listing the elegant wedding presents received, among them being a check of a large amount from Leo M. Hirsch, an uncle of the groom. This was my great-grandfather, proprietor of that block-long shoe store. The Hirsches were German Jews, Reform Jews, aspiring to post-social status and wealth, assimilation their goal. My father taught me that being Jewish was no different from being Christian. It's a religion, that's all, he would say, as if to convince himself as well. He wanted to pass, and he wanted me to pass, not inside the house or among fellow Jews, but in the Christian world. He insisted Hirsch was a German, not a Jewish name. For years, I didn't know he was wrong about our name, but I did know he was wrong about Judaism and Christianity. Growing up, I shared things with my Jewish friends I didn't share with my Gentile friends: a nod, a glance, a meaningful touch on a shoulder. I knew too there were places I wasn't welcome. Once visiting Grandma Rose, my father's mother, and Harry, my step-grandfather, in Miami Beach, where they spent winters, I saw a sign in a window of a boarding house: no Jews. I saw signs over drinking fountains, colored, white, with or without signs, America named its outsiders. In that old newspaper clipping, the word reverend replaced rabbi, temple replaced synagogue. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Mr. Levy of the Orange Street Temple. When you changed rabbi to reverend, you tossed away centuries of learning, letting assimilation subsume knowledge and culture. When I was a child, school forms asked for my religion. Write Hebrew, my father would say. What's wrong with putting Jewish? Just do it. My friends didn't go around calling themselves Hebrews. We were Jewish. We didn't say Jew, an insult. And because we were growing up in the shadow of the Second World War, we knew about concentration camps, gas chambers, and lampshades made of human skin. We whispered about those lampshades on the playground the way we whispered about sex, knowing and not knowing, believing and not believing. Okay, so that's my first reading, and
That was wonderful, Sandell. Thank you.
thank you.
Do we want to go right to those photos next? Is that?
Yeah, let's do the photos and then maybe another short reading after that.
Yeah.
And I know you have questions
I do.
that are going to be a surprise for me.
Yes, for the audience, I have not revealed my questions to Sandell. So, there's so many good things to talk about with this book. All right, so. There we go.
Okay, so I guess everybody's seeing. So this first slide is my studio at Moulana Nef, and it has the 4 essentials that I need to write. My computer, something flowering, either a plant or some flowers in a vase, my coffee, and a lined pad. I always start by hand on one of these lined pads. The second photo is of the fig, my hand holding a fig. Well, when I arrived in Ovilar, I was told that figs grew everywhere and I couldn't see one. And finally, a new friend, Priscilla, told me to think Adam and Eve. And so I imagined broad, dark leaves with deeply cut lobes. And I started looking, and lo and behold, I began to see the leaves, and underneath the leaves were these wonderful, wonderful figs. And I walked every day. I had about a 3 to 4 mile route that I walked every day. And I became, I think, Ovilar's most prolific fig thief. This is a path on the Shimon. A new friend invited me to walk with her for a weekend on the Shimon. And as I walked the path, we passed a number of pilgrims. Many of them were religious. Some of them they did this every year. Some of them were on a holiday, but all were very contemplative. And I was very aware that I was probably the only Jew walking this path. And I began to feel a little uneasy, and I'm like, what am I doing? And then Priscilla said to me that we were walking in the opposite direction. We were walking away from the shrine of St. James, not toward it. And I thought, well, that's pretty fitting for a Jew. This is the tallest house in Ovilar. And it's been boarded up. I've been visiting that village, as I said, since 2011, and it's been boarded up all these years. But during the Second World War, German soldiers patrolled and watched from that rooftop. And I would assume that they were looking for resistance activity, because in Ovilar, the Germans were not bivouacked in the village, but they were maybe just across the river, just a couple miles away. And so their presence was known in this village, and the resistance also operated in this village and so it was a very, very, very complicated time. This is the clock tower. This is the entrance to the village from the north. If you're coming into the centre-ville, you're coming in under that archway. And on the morning of August 26, 1942, trucks left the gendarmerie up the hill, and gendarmes drove under and through that archway. They stopped at the second building. There was a shop on the first floor, and in the rooms above, there was a Jewish family that was sheltering. And they were Bruno Gazella, his wife, and Adele, their 17-year-old daughter. And they were arrested that morning and driven to Septfonds, which was an internment camp on the outskirts of Montauban, a small city about an hour's drive from Ovilar. From Montauban, they were shipped to Drancy, which was an internment camp on the outskirts of Paris, and from there to Auschwitz, where all three were gassed on arrival. And there's another interesting story in the book about this family and about their suitcases, which were locked up in the town hall in the village for more than 50 years. This is a better story. This is a house in Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne. I met on on that first trip in 2011, I met a woman named Germaine Polyakov. She was a caretaker in a house that protected Jewish refugee children, and this is that house. Germaine was 92 when I met her, and she died this past February at 101. And I absolutely adored this woman, and we became very, very good friends. And so I made this trip to Ovilar, and she set up interviews for me with the town historian. And this was a Jewish house. It was in a square in the heart of the village, tiny square. And what you cannot see in the photograph are three things. One is a statue of the Virgin and Child. The second one is the very large Abbey of St. Peter that borders one side of the square. And another is a restaurant that was owned and operated by the Lopez family, Catholics who were also part of the resistance. And in rooms above that restaurant, their daughter, Adrienne, who was in her early 20s, cared for the youngest of the Jewish children. So here in a village, you have a house and Jewish refugee children, 70 of them, hiding in plain sight. And this is a water pump in the garden of a very, very large chateau. In this garden, but not in this particular spot, Gestapo arrested the parents of John Hirsch. And although I know and stood in front of the spot where that arrest happened, I just couldn't take a photo of it. I just felt like something that needed to be sacred, and it needed to be quiet, and it needed to be private. But I wanted something. So, and I just love this, this water pump. I think it's a sculpture. It's beautiful. So I took a picture of that. And those are our photos.
Sandell, do you want to read that second little section you were going to read? And then
Okay, sure. I can do that. So this one is about Germaine, and the only thing, two people that I think I mentioned that I need to tell you about are Germaine's husband was Leon Polyakov, Leon. And he was, during the war, he worked with the resistance, and he actually accompanied the French delegation to Nuremberg. He was a historian, and I had no idea when I met her that he was such a well-known person. And he, so he was very, people always came to the flat to see Leon. And the other person that I mentioned in here is my husband, Dick. I asked about a single day Germaine remembered vividly. Germaine folded her hands loosely in her lap and spoke of a day in 1944 when German soldiers were marching through Bayeux-sur-Dordogne and heading to Normandy. They were nervous, edgy, and shooting wildly. Germaine rounded her hands and drew a dome in front of her belly. Expecting my third child, carrying my baby in one arm, dragging Daniel by his hand, and running across a field to the woods. I heard a shot. I knew what it was. I wasn't frightened. I felt calm. I don't know why. Naturally, she was frightened, but fear propelled her and gave her strength. A pregnant woman carrying her baby, dragging her toddler, her heart pounding, her belly cramping, adrenaline pumping her legs. I looked into my cup of golden tea. How did she find her way through all that, then integrate into the person she had become? A few days before, Germaine's granddaughter, a woman who became very religious and lived in Israel, had come to visit with her children, boys who wore payas, side curls. I wanted to make them lunch, Germaine said. They came from so far. I offered a cup of tea. My granddaughter refused. She would not let the boys eat, not even a cookie. This woman was the daughter of the baby in Germaine's belly that day she raced for the woods. I knew they were Orthodox, Germaine said. Still, I was insulted. I don't like Orthodox. She meant orthodoxy. I agreed. Had I been visiting that day, I would have told that granddaughter to forget her rules of kashrut that allowed her to eat only kosher foods from kosher plates and drink only from kosher cups. I would have told her to take a cup of tea with her grandmother, to let Germaine give cookies to the boys. Their great-grandmother had been to the edge and survived. To break bread, to share a meal with family and friends, this was nachas, a Yiddish word that, like most Yiddish words, squiggled out from under definition. Nachas was pleasure, but more than pleasure. Nachas was the pure joy a child brought to a parent or grandparent. Speaking English, Germaine said, the more and more I get old, the more I can express what I feel. Only now I realize my life was not ordinary. So we agreed. At the door, Germaine said, "People tell me I was courageous to do what I did. I did not know. Perhaps courage is acting not out of bravery, but out of the essence of who you are." Germaine offered her cheek, and we kissed. She was tired. She must nap. We talked a long time. "You were going back to the States," she said. "Yes," I said. I'd been away a month. I had decided, with fairness to Dick, a month was the limit for my absences. For years, he provided the financial and emotional support for me to become more than I ever thought I could be, and I was grateful. Germaine and I exchanged email addresses. She took my hand and held on. "You must tell me when you will return." Not if I would return, when. I thought about journalists coming to interview Léon, but never Germaine, as she sat in one of the apricot velvet chairs, looking on, her own story rumbling. Yes, I would return to listen to Germaine and continue my search for answers to questions I hardly knew. The best way to find what I was looking for was let it reveal itself.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I was so glad when Sandell, when you told me that you were going to read that section, because it was one of the ones that I had marked in such a pivotal moment in the book, one of many. And I guess I would love it to start this off by saying, asking how maybe if you could talk a little bit more about some of the ways you learned to let the project reveal itself, because it is one in which you sort of, you're as we're reading the book, you're thinking it's going in this direction, and then another story opens up and it goes over there. So I wondered if you could just maybe pick one or two of those moments out when you sort of realized that you had to sort of back up and let things happen.
I think the deeper I got into it, I didn't start out to write a narrative.
Right.
I started out to write essays.
Mm-hmm.
And my original thought was to collect these essays into a collection. And at that time, essay collections were not the thing that any agent was really looking for. And I took a class at Grub Street in Boston called Finding Your Book. And it was taught by a literary agent who also teaches in an MFA program. And I thought, well, she would be just the perfect person for me. And she really felt that it was not working at all as a collection. And her first advice was, why don't you write little paragraphs and put them in the italics before each essay to create a thread? Well, that got me to the point of kind of feeling that my own story was going to link something. But that wasn't working either. So I had to turn it into a narrative. But in the meantime, I just really kept following leads. I had originally wanted to interview Jean Hirsch.
Mm-hmm.
I had set up an interview with him, and then he canceled. And then I tried another one, and then suddenly he was out of town. And Valerie Fert, who was introduced to me by a mutual friend, said to me that she knew that I must be so disappointed about not seeing Jean Hirsch, but she had someone for me to interview, and that someone was Germaine. And she actually made that appointment without even asking me. So when I talk about falling down into this work, I did fall down into it. And then Germaine asked if I would like to meet one of the children who had lived in the house that she cared for. And I thought, was that even possible? And before I could say anything, now Germaine, don't forget, she's like 92, 93, and she has a cane and she doesn't want to use it. So the minute she said that, she was shot up from the table, and we heard her in the next room. She was on the phone talking to this woman and setting up an interview with me. So Yeah, I did that, Gibson. I followed those kind of leads. But what I also did was walk around the city and look at all these places and absorb. I read a lot. I visited the Memorial de la Shoah in Paris numbers of times. I sought out memorials. I just tried to I just absorbed everything. I just really feel that every footfall was research.
Yeah, absolutely. Another aspect of that, and that you note in the book, and you just made reference to it earlier too, that you're coming to this not as a journalist, right, but as a writer, and part of the story of the book is the story of its making, and we see you learning how to read people and interview people and get their story even when they or get parts of the story and piece things together, even when with some of the people that clearly don't want to reveal things or have a certain point of view, and we see you kind of growing and more and more comfortable in that role as an interviewer of people, as a person who's piecing the story together. And I'm wondering, were there particular interviews or moments with people where you felt like, oh, I'm starting to get this, to get this interview thing, or was it always just like, I'm fumbling in the dark here, and I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna try to follow this wherever it goes.
I think a lot of it. Oh, well, there's one story there. It's hard to know when to lead someone back or let them go on. And I missed the story of that family that I told you about because at one point there's another man in the book, Gerhard Schneider. He's a Catholic theologian, and his wife, Mary Jo, is an academic, and she's French, and they both retired to Auvillard, and Gerhard is very interested in this history. And at one point, I discover it's as if this family is just my brand new discovery. And when I go to see Gerhard, he said to me, "I tried to tell you, you only wanted to hear about Hirsch." So yeah, I think there's a lot of backtracking, and I was lucky. I kept going back year after year, and I interviewed these people a number of times. I couldn't have done it on one interview for each person.
Right. I was also struck by that wonderful quote that you give about a little less than halfway through the book from Amos Oz, that describes a Jew as someone who chooses to share the fate of other Jews or who is condemned to do so. And it's a quote that seems like it's well placed in the book, as it seems like a kind of a touchstone for the book. I mean, there's your own story of claiming or stepping into, your own Jewish heritage and faith. And I was wondering about how much of that process of stepping into that part of yourself was sort of already happening, or how much of it was really became about because of the making of the book.
It was happening for a long time,
Yeah.
but the part that hung on the longest was the way that I could move through Christian society without identifying. And I'm much more comfortable. I mean, I'm a Jewish woman, and I am part of that community. That's who I am.
Yeah. And we see it. It unfolds in such a beautiful way in the book. We can talk about the end, but we're not going to spoil. Folks will have to read it. I was also thinking about the issue of, so much of this book revolves around memory, and your own memory, and also taking other people back into their memory. And then also it's very clear at lots of different points in the book that you were also doing your research and really, doing the background work to try to piece things together and check facts, and as much as that was possible. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that balance between research and memory, and like moving back and forth between those.
I don't think it was planned. It was just something I knew I needed to do. And I wanted to also place the events that Germaine was talking about within history. And so probably my greatest source was Robert O. Paxton and Vichy France, 1940 to 1944. It's an amazing book. I read a lot, and I'm fascinated with memory, and I'm also fascinated with the way memory kind of moves through generations. And I'm also very interested in story and memory, because it's really not memory that shapes us, it's the story around that memory, and that story changes for different people in a family, and it changes for you. I have a story of my father in that book, where he told me, and I believed all my life, that his father died of a heart attack in front of his eyes. And then I won't say the word because I can say it in the book, but I can't say it here. And then my aunt said to me, that's not true. But it didn't matter, because that's what shaped my father's life, and that's what shaped my life.
One of the things I love about this book is the way it helps us to enter the past and sort of be, and as much as that's possible, to sort of be in a past moment. And you have you speak to that. There's a quote, "It was not impossible. You could reach back and touch the past." And, that very much feels like sort of the part of the project of this book. And I guess I was just wondering about, did those moments for you as a writer or a person, did that happen? Did you have particular moments where you felt like, oh, I'm seeing it. I'm seeing this moment of the past? Or did it happen in the writing when sort of all the pieces were coming together in your head?
I think that I think it relates to Judaism, because there is a saying that the Jewish present is a living past. And so the Judaism is very much a religion of stories. I mean, we tell each other stories, and it's a generational religion. And I did take a lot of classes on the women in the Bible. I was particularly interested in feminism and in new interpretations and ways of looking at the stories. And I can't tell you now, but at the time I knew who was the mother to this one, and who was the grandmother, and who was the son and brother and whatever. And throughout those generations, there is an influence of the behavior of a father influences the behavior of a son. So that's very much ingrained in me. So I think that, and also I just walking around those streets, knowing what had happened, where, I just felt that presence.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've answered you or not. But.
Oh yeah. Well, it was sort of an unanswerable question. That's a great answer. Let's see. Why don't let's take a couple questions from the audience, and I see one that just popped up from Taffy Field, who is somebody I know, and I wonder, Taffy, do you want to mic up and ask your question directly?
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm curious about whether you're fluent in French, and if you are or aren't, how that influenced your engagement both with the town and with the inhabitants, with the people you got to know.
Okay, I am not fluent in French. My French is terrible. When I first started this project, I went to see a dear friend, Rabbi Lev, and told him what I was doing. And he said, that I was interested in Jewish history at the time of the Second World War. And he said, oh, if you're interested in that, I have someone for you to meet. She lives in Paris. She speaks fluent English, and she studied Jewish history. And so I met this woman virtually, and then we met in person. She became my translator and a dear friend. And she was the one who introduced me to Germaine. Gerhard spoke English. English was his third language. German is first, French is second, English is third. And he actually came with me to translate for a woman who lived in the village. She was not there during the Second World War. She was younger than her husband. Her husband, although she never really admitted it, but it's fairly well known that he worked in the resistance. She did not deny that. But when someone asked if he was Jewish, her husband, she said, no, not Jewish. So I made my way that way. Robert, another man in the book, is French, and he speaks enough English. He retired to the village. Yet his whole family is Catholic and French, and his father was on the Maginot Line and was captured. So I had all these kinds of ins, but I had enough people who would speak English. Mm-hmm. And I could understand a little bit of French, so.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
There's a comment from Diane Reed. Diane, did you want to jump in here and make your comment?
Sure. I just was going to mention that I've read a lot about the resistance from the networks, the history of the networks that were there, which there were so many, but I often wondered how the villagers were so organized. That's what strikes me. It seems more like what you did with your book is sort of talk to the actual people in the towns and how they kept this moving. And I know they made connections, but it's just so interesting to me how they just seem to know what to do and when to do it.
Well, the house that had the Jewish refugee children was operated by the Jewish Scouts. And what happened during the war was that, you're right, there were a gazillion refugee networks working all over the place. And the Jewish Scouts had their organization in place. And during the war, they turned all of their skills and all of their organization to rescue Jewish children. And so they were operating in that area, but I think there were other resistance groups operating in that area as well. And so that house for girls was in Bouillé-sur-Dôme, about 2 hours drive, just about 15 miles from Auvillard is the town of Moissac, and the Jewish Scouts were operating a house for boys there. I have no idea. The network and the messages and the collaboration, it boggles the mind. It really does. Yeah.
Sandell, that also makes me think of a moment in the book where you write, for that, it seemed was what had saved the Jews sheltering in the name of the town that I don't want to say because my French is terrible. a certain quiet, collective, yet independent understanding and a desire not particularly to do good, but at least to do no harm. It was like that there was this understanding among certain people, not everybody, obviously, because some people did harm, but there were some that were sort of quietly organized.
I think what really, if I could get any message across, it's like, you don't need to be a hero. Just don't do harm. And I think that when I interviewed the historian in Bouillé-sur-Dôme, he said to me, French people during that time, they just wanted the war to be over and they just wanted to eat. It's just like, we want this pandemic to be over and let's get on with our lives. And they pretty much felt that way. But I did feel that certain places I don't know what it was that made certain villages be more sympathetic than others. For example, in Bouillon-sur-Jourdan, there was a man they called the friendly gendarme, because the French made the arrests. It was not the Germans. And the orders came to the gendarmerie. Don't forget, this was like my husband used to sell sardines in railroad cars. You had to route the railroad cars. You can't have one railroad car coming, on top of another. It was the same thing. They were transporting humans instead of sardines. And they had to have holding camps, and then they had to have trains and all of this. So the orders would come to the gendarmerie, and this one gendarme would go knock on the door of that house and say, "You must leave now, the Germans are coming."
Unreal. We have a related question from Solange Kellerman. Solange, do you want to ask your question?
Here we go. How was it that the refugees ended up in OVR? As a side note, I was born in France in Montluçon at the end of the war, and I have a brother who was in his teens during that time. So I've heard a lot of stories, and I know how they ended up there, but I'm curious about how the Jews ended up in this little tiny village.
So I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question. You're asking how they ended up in this village?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I don't know how the Hirsch family ended up there. I know that they were refugees from the Alsace. They went to Paris, and from Paris, they went south. And John Hirsch claims that his family was on one of the last trains that got through the demarcation line. And the other families, it was part of this whole network of finding shelter for people. And the Kurzweil family was sheltering in Montauban. There was a Jewish network and protection area in Montauban. And then the housing was scarce in Montauban. And so they sent 5 families to this village, to Auvillard, to shelter. And that's how they ended up there.
The first part of mine was, I was born in France at the end of the war, and my family evacuated from Strasbourg when the Germans invaded Poland. So I have this whole story about them ending up in southern France.
I know, it's totally.
But I was curious about why that village.
I'm sorry, I missed that. How? Gibson, can you help me out here?
Yeah, she just said she was curious about why that village in particular, Auvillard.
Why I got there, or why the refugees?
The refugees, I think, yeah.
I think it was about the larger part of the organization looking for safe housing for people.
Yeah.
And I thought that it would be, I guess, safe enough, if not safe.
Mm-hmm.
But also at that time, that summer of 1942 was just after the Hitler put the final solution into place, and he had huge quotas for the French of roundups.
Sandell, I thank you for your question, Solange. Sandell, I was wondering, another thing you reference in the book is, in talking about your own story, is you talk about past lives as a dancer, as an English teacher, and then you're talking about, some of your time as a mother, as a wife, as a part-time journalist. And I was wondering, kind of looking back, did you ever envision that you would write a book like this?
No, not like this, because one subject I never ever wanted to touch was the Holocaust.
Mm.
I figured I don't know anything about it, really. I'm not a historian. It's hard, I've read Elie Wiesel, I've read Primo Levi. It's like, if you haven't witnessed, if you haven't been there, do you have any right to do that? And as you know, in the book, I really take, what's his name, Life is Beautiful to task.
Yeah.
Because for me, there are certain things you don't mess with. So no, I never dreamed I would write this book, but in a way, it is my story. So in a way, it was almost inevitable. I think that my story frames this, but the other part of it, no, I never dreamed I would do this.
Mm-hmm. There's that other great moment that it is also a connection between your story and this much, much bigger story, and one that I think any of us could connect our own stories to, which is, where is it? That line about when you don't face the truth, it's Valerie, she says, when you don't face the truth comes back to you like a boomerang. And there's the individual version of that, and then there's the societal version of that, right? Yeah. So
yeah.
I was wondering, we're just, maybe time for another question or two, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, about the title, because there's that lovely moment toward the end of the book where that sort of gets explained, and I wondered if you could, people will read that on their own, but
Right.
Can you say a little bit more about that title and the
Sure, as it does seem a little bit odd. What is, but it really struck me. So the Marais is the Jewish quarter in Paris, and I always stayed there. I loved it there, and I always stayed on one side, and I didn't know the other side very well. So I love walking tours. So I took a walking tour of that other side of the Marais, and we stopped at a place, and this guide was pointing to one of the limestone blocks, and all of France was once an inland sea, and the limestone that they still use to construct for the buildings comes from underneath the city. And so he was pointing something out, and he's like, do you see? I didn't see anything. Fig leaves, figs, I don't see figs. I don't see what he's trying to show me. And suddenly I got really close, and it was an indentation of a shell. So he was showing that fossils still existed, and that the limestone indeed did come from a sea. And I was so fascinated that the group went on, and I went up, and I'm looking and touching. And later on, we were in another garden, and he was looking down into the pebbles. I thought they were pebbles. And then he plucked something, and he dropped it into my palm, and I've got it. And it was this teeny, teeny, tiny spiral shell. And it became sort of a something that became very, very, I don't know, where's the camera? There it is. There, teeny tiny little thing. And it also became a metaphor for the way the stories spiraled up, and I spiraled down into them. So the spiral shell.
It's lovely. That's lovely. Well, I want to thank you so much for doing this. This is wonderful. And thanks to print. I want to remind people to go to print and order a copy of the book. It's well worth your time. And thanks to Mechanics Hall for co-sponsoring this with us. And Sandell, I wonder, is there anything, you want to say anything here before we take it away?
I do. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. And it's a bizarre way to sort of like be together, because you're not really together, but you are here. And I'm just so grateful to you, to everyone. So thanks.
Great. That's a great place to leave it. And I see Elizabeth was just holding up a copy of the book. Wonderful. Thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll do it again sometime soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Take care.